Another big story we're following tonight. A court has ruled 2 Rochester police officers used excessive force.
Welcome once again to another video by the Junkyard News. And in today's video news story, we're going to detail a lawsuit out of New York and how a federal court judge just slapped 2 Rochester police officers in a case of excessive force during an arrest nearly 10 years ago. This involves a lawsuit filed by Mr. David Vann regarding an incident outside a convenience store in Rochester, New York. So let's get into the meat and potatoes about what happened. On September 4th, back in 2015, at approximately 11 p.m., Mr. Vann was at the A&Z Market convenience store located on South Avenue in the city of Rochester, which had 4 properly functioning video surveillance cameras. Now, Vann went into the store and wanted to pay 75 cents for a single loose cigarette. Didn't want to buy the old pack, just wanted 1 cigarette. When handing Vann back his change, shortchanged him by approximately $7. And Vann requested the remaining change that he was due, but the store owner refused. It's claimed that Vann asked the employee again for his change back, and that the store employee assaulted him and pushed him out of the market. In other words, saying, "What are you going to do about it?" Now, once Mr. Vann was pushed out of the store, it's claimed that the store owner locked the door, wouldn't let him back inside, and eventually Mr. Vann gave up, realized he wasn't going to get his money, and left. And as Vann began walking home, it's claimed that the store owner opened the door and yelled to him down the street, "Hey, come on back and get your change." So Vann turned around and returned to the market. But what Mr. Vann didn't know is that the store owner had called the police, and it would seem that this was a ruse just to keep him in the area until police arrived. And then once a couple of police officers from the Rochester Police Department responded to the 911 call, things escalated from there. Now, Mr. Vann complained to the officer, and in this case it was Officer Matthew Drake, about being shortchanged and then being kicked out of the store. And as Mr. Vann, the store owner, and Officer Drake were discussing the matter, another officer, RPD Officer Sean Mitchell, arrived on scene. While Drake continued to speak to Vann inside the store, another officer, RPD Investigator Jeffrey Kester, also responded to the scene. Now, once Rochester Police Department had enough officers at the scene, Officer Drake asked Mr. Vann to follow him outside the market, and Mr. Vann immediately complied and left the market. But then, to his surprise, Officer Mitchell detained him in the doorway and prevented him from walking outside for about a minute and a half. Vann complained again to all 3 officers about being shortchanged, and it happens on a regular basis, he stated. And then he complained about being physically kicked out of the store that evening, just for wanting his money. Now, the store owner did admit to all the officers, Drake, Kester, and Mitchell, that he had assaulted Vann. But Mitchell, however, told Mr. Vann, "No one gives an F about your money," and directed him to leave or he would be arrested for trespassing. Now, once Vann did leave the market and stepped out on the public sidewalk after complying and leaving the store, he was immediately detained on the sidewalk, a public place, by Officer Mitchell, Kester, and Drake. Kester made it clear to Vann he was not free to leave. Kester and Mitchell placed Vann under arrest and handcuffed Vann's wrists behind his back in a painful manner, the complaint says. And though Vann was not resisting in any way, Mitchell pulled Vann's hands and wrists upwards towards his head after he was handcuffed, causing substantial pain. Officer Kester then grabbed the back of Vann's neck and dragged him head first towards a metal bench on the sidewalk while Mitchell and Drake pushed Vann from behind. Now, once they got the head of steam going, Mitchell, Drake, and Kester and Vann all fell to the ground all of a sudden, with Kester pulling Vann on top of him as they fell, and Mitchell and Drake pushing Vann from behind. Now, Mr. Vann's head ended up slamming into a metal bench as a result of it. During the fall, Vann suffered serious injuries to his head. And in a twisted turn of fate, one of the officers, Officer Kester, ended up breaking his leg from the fall. So you can guess what happens next. Officer is injured because of what they did, but somehow it's Mr. Vann's fault. So what do these officers of Rochester Police do? They proceed to beat Vann for about 2 minutes by striking him in the head and body with closed fist, mainly Officer Mitchell. Now, after Officer Mitchell was finished dishing out his blue line justice, Mitchell then searched Vann, grabbed him by his handcuffs, dragged him to his feet, and walked him over to Mitchell's vehicle. And as Mitchell and Vann walked up to the police cruiser, Mitchell is seen on video slamming Vann into the side of the vehicle and punched him in the face while Vann was still handcuffed. Now, Officer Drake, who was standing close by Mitchell, ended up joining in the assault of Mr. Vann. Drake and Mitchell slammed Vann into the vehicle and onto the sidewalk thereafter, causing serious injuries to Vann and also injuring the Officer Drake's shoulder. That's right. So now they got two officers due to them deciding to use force on a man who was shortchanged at a store and had the audacity to complain about it and want his money back. They decide to initiate force against the victim somehow. And in the process of doing so, now two officers are injured. One broke his leg, one hurt his shoulder from actions they initiated, from force they used that was not needed against a complying suspect. Now, although the security video doesn't have audio, one can only assume that Mr. Vann himself was utilizing his First Amendment and his speech towards the officers in a way possibly that they did not like. And maybe that's why they decided to issue a little blue line payback for his speech. Now, after these two officers had slammed Vann into the vehicle and threw him down to the sidewalk, which caused, again, the officers' injuries, Mitchell continued to punch Vann in the head and body, grabbed him by his testicles and shirt, picked him up and slammed him face down on the sidewalk again. While Vann was handcuffed and lying face down on the sidewalk, Mitchell sprayed him in the face also with pepper spray for about 5 seconds, at a distance of 2 or 3 inches away from Vann's face. Officer Mitchell sat on Vann's back and held him there for about 30 seconds. Mitchell rolled Vann face up and punched him in the head and torso, once again, as he was laying there handcuffed. Now, the complaint also claims that once they took Vann into custody and arrested him for trespassing, among other things, they drove him to the jail. Once they arrived at the jail, Mitchell, Keppert, and other defendant officers removed him from the RPD vehicle and once again, threw him to the ground, punched and kicked him numerous times in the head and body. When they brought Vann inside the jail, they falsely informed staff that Vann had assaulted both Kester and Drake and caused them to suffer serious injuries, i.e. a broken leg and separated shoulder. Additionally, Mitchell, Kester, and other unnamed RPD officers instructed jail staff members to place him in solitary confinement and to not provide him any medical treatment for his injuries suffered at the hands of police officers that night in retaliation for Vann resisting arrest and injuring 2 officers. And then once Vann was arraigned, he found out he was charged with 2 counts of assault in the 2nd degree, a count of assault in the 3rd degree, resisting arrest, and trespass. So that's the basics of what happened that night. So Vann and his attorneys file a lawsuit. And now, almost 10 years later, while the case is going through the courts, like most attorneys do eventually, Vann's attorney filed with the court a motion for summary judgment. Some of you may not know what summary judgment is, so let's get into it briefly. Now, a motion for summary judgment is a request made by a party in a lawsuit asking the court to forego a jury trial and settle the case immediately by looking at all the facts. It's asking the court to rule in that party's favor before the trial. And in federal court, this motion argues that there are no genuine disputes over material facts of the case, and that the party that is asking for summary judgment is entitled to a judgment as a matter of law. Essentially, it claims that even if all facts are viewed in light most favorable to the opposing party, in this case, the City of Rochester and Rochester PD, that the case can be decided by looking at the merits of the case and the facts that aren't disputed without waiting to go to trial. Now, the main part about these motions for summary judgment is that they are nearly filed in every lawsuit, but they are rarely, and I mean rarely, successful. So, in an unprecedented turn of events, a federal court judge who received a motion from Vann's attorney for summary judgment actually ruled that the 2 Rochester police officers did use excessive force during the arrest. This judge agreed so strongly with Vann and his attorney that in her opinion, she states, "The court grants plaintiff's motion in part with respect to his excessive force claims against Officer Mitchell and Officer Drake. Judge Wolford held that much of the force used by Mitchell and Drake was excessive as a matter of law and doesn't need to be decided by a jury. She also ruled that some of the force used by Mitchell and all the force used by Kester, Brodsky, and Dempsey might be excessive, but the issue must be determined by a jury. Where the security footage and the videotape of the relevant events exist, and there are no disputes about the accuracy of the video, a court deciding a motion for summary judgment must view the facts in light depicted by the videotape. So in other words, the judge looked at the evidence, looked at the video, and although the lawsuit has multiple and several defendants, the judge focused on the motion for summary judgment against the two most main characters, two officers that in the plaintiff's eyes did most of the damage and was undisputed. And the judge agreed and said there's no way a jury wouldn't find at least some of the force they used against Mr. Vann as being excessive. It's clearly on the video. You can see it for yourself. The jury will see it for themselves. There's no way that a jury is not going to find at least something with all that force, at least some part of it, as excessive. So as far as those two officers go, summary judgment has been reached, which means the main two characters of the Rochester Police Department were found by this judge to have used excessive force. Now, any of the other defendants down the line, the jail staff, all that, they're going to have to keep going and work their way to trial. But as far as the two main characters go, the court found them guilty of using excessive force and granted summary judgment. Now, the city did reply to these events. The city's law department is evaluating now the court's decision to determine whether there are grounds to move to alter or vacate the partial judgment that was in favor of Mr. Vann. And the city's excuse was that this incident occurred nearly 9 years ago under a different administration and a different leadership in the Rochester Police Department. Because it happened 9 years ago and it takes this long just to get to this point in the court case, it's not our fault. We shouldn't have to pay a judgment because there's new leadership, because there's new people on the city council and in the county offices and in the bureaucracy. We're all new, okay? So none of the command staff should be held liable, and the city shouldn't be really held liable to pay this judgment or pay for this case because it wasn't our administration that it happened under. Can you believe the audacity of these government officials? It wasn't our fault. It wasn't our administration that this happened under. So why should we have to pay? Why should the taxpayers have to pay? You know what? I agree. Why should taxpayers have to pay for these two officers' actions? Should come out of their pension and they should have to pay. What do you think? Comment below. Should taxpayers have to pay and flip the bill to make this man whole for what Rochester police officers did to him that night? Should the officers have to forego any pension that they have to pay this man for the beating that they gave him unjustly? Most likely, most of whatever judgment this man gets is going to come not solely from taxpayers, but the insurance company. But still, personally, I think the majority of whatever money is given to Mr. Vann should come out of the offending officer's own pocket, whether that be their pension, pay out any vacation or personal time off, and hand that cash over to Mr. Vann. And then whatever's left, then the insurance company can pick up the tab for. What do you think? Comment below. Thanks again for watching this episode of the Junkyard News.